This schematic represents the standard computational model of the mind. It maps a linear flow where data enters a central node to be processed before exiting. This passive processor sits idle, waiting for external triggers, reducing conscious experience to the language of machinery. This deterministic view fails to account for human creative intent. It describes a system that can only react to what it is given, rather than a system that originates its own direction. Applying engineering principles to ontological questions regarding the self creates a distorted picture. We begin to view consciousness as a fixed object, rather than a living event. Any model treating human consciousness as a static entity awaiting external commands is inadequate. It ignores the reality of a mind that is constantly in motion. The author proposes a different metaphysical statement. The act is the input from self, and the output from self. External input comes from the environment, but an input from self is drawn from the system's own internal states. Grasping this loop requires process ontology. This branch of philosophy suggests that reality is not composed of permanent things, but of ongoing occurrences. Within this framework, the self exists as an active verb. It is a process that only remains in existence through its own operation. This is a perpetual engine. The act of operation does not just belong to the entity. The act is the entity. Viewing the mind as an engine shifts the parameters of inquiry. Instead of asking what the mind is made of, we must analyze how the mind functions. Moving past the language of machinery involves elevating the self to a dynamic, self-generating metaphysical principle. We can model this system as a recursive loop. The output vector curves backward to become its starting point. This closed geometry represents the totality of the act. There is no central processor node in this architecture. The interior is empty. In this model, the loop itself is the only structure. There is no hidden operator inside driving the system. Structural integrity depends entirely on continuous operation. The loop only maintains its shape as long as the pulse is moving. A process-based entity is more fragile than a substance-based one. It cannot be paused or put into storage. It exists only while it is active. Because the self is the operation, if the loop of action stops, the self ceases. We must look at how the pulse changes as it travels this loop. The input parameter consists of the past, baseline state of the self. As this state cycles, internal friction, the act of processing itself, serves as the source of creative intent. This internal pressure modifies data as it moves. The generated output is a completely new, modified state of self. At the end of the cycle, the system undergoes integration. This new output is not expelled into the environment. It is absorbed back into the loop. Mechanical systems expel finalized products. Conscious systems reintegrate them. This newly integrated output immediately becomes the required input for the very next cycle. This creates a flow of continuous self-creation. The state of the self at the start of a loop is always a product of the loop immediately preceding it. This engine is perpetual because it can never reach a finished state while conscious. Every finish line is a new starting gate. This is an engine of creation because it continuously generates its own subsequent operating architecture. A flat circle implies endless repetition. If the loop never changed altitude, the self would be trapped in stagnation. To represent the accumulation of conscious experience, the loop must transform into an upward 3D spiral. This vertical axis represents the progress of creative integration. Each rotation encompasses the previous states, but operates at a higher tier of complexity. This geometric growth is the visual equivalent of learning and memory. It is metaphysically impossible for the system to return to a purely identical past state, as every cycle carries the weight of cycles before it. This expanding 3D geometry defines the architecture of the dynamic engine. The conscious self exists as an ever-expanding trajectory of integrated experience. A split-screen comparison shows the divide between cognitive cybernetics and the metaphysical loop. On the left, data originates externally. On the right, we see internal self-generation. The first model uses a static mechanical node. The second relies on the active intent inherent in the process itself. One model expels data. The other reintegrates it into the self. This marks a shift from an object-oriented metaphysics, where things perform acts, to a process-oriented metaphysics, where things are acts. Using input-output terminology is philosophically risky. It only becomes accurate when modified by the phrase "from self." Treating the mind as a mere input-output machine is an ontological failure that strips the individual of creative agency. The purpose of this framework is to elevate the act into a metaphysical principle. There is an inseparable relationship between the existence of the self and the execution of the act. In the loop of conscious existence, the self serves simultaneously as its own fuel and its own fire.